Good evening, everybody, and thanks very much for coming. My name is Louise. I'm Director of Arts at the Barbican, where we have worked with Complicite and co-commissioned a lot of their work since 2001. So it's wonderful to be here. So, to start off with Judith and Simon, I just want to ask you very briefly to try and describe your relationship with each other, just by way of introducing each other. What is it that's made it work for so long, and what do you respect about what you bring to each other?
Do you want to go first?
We're married.
Judith, you start then.
Well, I should say that I saw a programme on the television. I had seen Complicity and Complicity's work live before I worked with the company, but then I saw Simon in a documentary on television, and I thought, wow, that company looks extraordinary. I want to work with them. I felt very, very strongly that that was going to be a job I was going to go for. And a job, by some strange serendipity, suddenly a job was advertised, and I thought, this is my dream come true. I applied for the job, and I was just reminding Simon that actually when I went for the interview, there was nobody there. Nobody had turned up to interview me, and I realised that they were unbelievably disorganised. So I thought, okay, I can see this is my calling. And I've just absolutely loved the work. And every time somebody says to me, do you think you should possibly think about doing something else in maybe with another theatre company, with another director? I kind of think, you know what, it just wouldn't be satisfying enough, because the work that Simon produces is really so extraordinary and so challenging. I really can't imagine working for anybody else. And I think if I didn't work with Simon and help him make his work, I would probably become a nurse or a gardener. I do something completely different. So, I mean, it's really simple for me. I just think his work's fantastic.
So you better be nice back.
Well, no, I mean, it's very simple for me, too, that we've now worked together for 20 years. But the work that we have made latterly together would not have happened without Judith. It's a completely it's not merely a question of producing work, but the fact that she has strange that we're talking about each other. It's very hard. I don't know how that question has got into this situation, but it is true. I mean, it's quite interesting, I suppose, from the point of view of what it means to be a producer, because the normal system, you have an artistic director who decides what they're going to do, and you work out a season, and then the producer goes away and produces it, but that's not the way it works here. I'm very slow, and I'm constantly saying that I don't want to do something, and Judith manages to help me get to a point where I can make something, which is a great deal more than producing. And it's a much more complex and interwoven relationship than it might be in other circumstances where a producer comes in, does their job for 5 to 10 years, and then moves on to a better job. It's a very different kind of relationship.
Well, let's go back to the beginning, which was the pre-Judith years, as it were. 1983, when the company started, I think, with 4 people from the Lecoq School, where you met at the Lecoq School, as I understand.
Well, one not, yeah.
One not, okay. What was the vision that you had? Why did the 4 of you get together, and what is it that you wanted to achieve?
Well, initially, we simply wanted to make a show. And so we were going to make a show for a few months, and then that was going to be it. But then, as a consequence of that show, we were asked to apply for an Arts Council grant, and then we got one, and then suddenly we got another one, and then suddenly years go by, and you're a company. But the as it were, the defining force was, I would call it an act of resistance, was a kind of both there are various things that bound us together. A social and political outlook, and feeling that there was, when we went to the theatre, we weren't seeing what we wanted to see or hearing what we wanted to hear. And seeing it in a way that was not produced, that might speak to people in a completely new way. But an act of resistance, I would say, is what bound us together.
That takes me to my next question, really, because you really changed the way I think that people think about theatre. I think Complicity has done that. And at the beginning, there was only Complicity, but you've been copied a lot, and I'm not going to say who I think has copied you, but you have been. And that, are you flattered by that you have influenced other people? Do you like the fact that the work is on the A-level syllabus, or does sort of acceptance bring a sort of unbearable weight of expectation with it? Did you prefer those days when it was maybe a little bit more controversial? Or do you still see it as controversial?
Well, I would
or
say...
maybe you never did.
I don't know. You answer.
Okay. Well, I can't really answer the one about the A-level syllabus.
Yeah.
Don't know who's sitting sitting out here, if there's any people studying the company. I mean, that's kind of complementary, and yet you do wonder, what are they studying? Because one of the interesting things over the years that Simon has always said is, why are people writing their dissertations about us? What are they writing? There have been times when he's said, I don't really know what I'm doing here. So how is anybody able to write something down about it? So when people used to ring us before the days of the internet and say, have you got any information on the company? I'm writing my dissertation. We'd always say, fantastic, could you send it to us? Because we'd be really interested to know what they were saying. But so it's sort of complementary, but it's not written about what I do, so I'm sure Simon would have a feeling about that. I do go to theatre sometimes and see people doing sort of work that I feel is really highly influenced by the company, and sometimes I get quite cross, and sometimes I think that's, how dare they? But sometimes you just think, well, it's impossible for things not to, infiltrate into other people's work. That's art, really, I think.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think it's very, very simply, theatre is a magpie art form. Everybody copies everybody else, and the theatre actually steals from every other art form there is. And in many ways, it's had to do a lot more of it over the last 20 or 30 years. I mean, if you look at the history of dance, I would say in the 20th century that dance stole hugely from theatre very, very early on, whether you're talking about the ballet russe at the end of the 19th century, and Diaghilev and Isadora Duncan, through to Mary Wigman, and the whole, right up to the question of the extraordinary and, for me, very influential work of Pina Bausch, which was, for my generation, was an absolute explosion, because it was theatre, pure theatre. It wasn't a question of people sort of studying dance moves. It was subject matter, content made physically present in front of you. I grew up in the era of rock music, and essentially they were theatre shows, and they were also stealing the language of the theatre. In the meantime, the theatre remained rather the theatre, and there was a set, and you kind of, I think probably you'll find this, here we go.
So it's not a sound cue, it's real.
It's not a sound cue, it's real. Or maybe it was a sound cue.
They were very on
the ball. Yeah. But, and I think that the theatre needs, I think you steal from anywhere. People talk about the fact that, we have used modern technology or video. I'm not really interested in that. I mean, video is just light, and light has been part of the theatre since its inception. There's nothing new about it. I think the key thing is, what are the stories that you're telling?
Yeah.
Of course, the form of the way that you're telling has another, for me, a very big sort of political subtext to it, because it changes people's consciousness, the way that people think. I always believe that before you make a piece of theatre, there is a text, and it comes from something that you're talking about. Even if you talk about this table, there is a whole text about it, about where it was made, who made it, how much they got paid, and so on. And that for me is fundamentally important. So there is a text, but the text is not merely the one of the words that are spoken. That is like, Peter Brook has talked about that being like a map. Mm-hmm. And of course, a play itself is not theatre. It can become marvellous theatre in the hands of a great theatre maker. There's the Baldwin play that was here, the Amen Corner, which became a wonderful piece of theatre, I thought. But I think it's not necessarily an extraordinary play. The Inspector Calls was not necessarily an incredible play. I've seen really boring productions of it. You go, Priestley is so boring, but Daldry made an extraordinary piece of theatre out. For God's sake, how many works of Shakespeare where we've come out and gone, well, Shakespeare's really overrated. That was, I was half asleep in the second half. Well, it's not, that is the map, but it's got to be taken and made into something. So what you see must be in relation to the words that you hear, and what you hear perhaps in terms of the sound or music underneath it, or the light that you see. These work like a musical score, and all these different elements form harmonies, and you can have just everything. It can be a wonderful thing which is just a melody. There is that kind of theatre too, but I suppose what interests me is the idea that you have an experience where you go away and somehow, unlike the television, which I would call perhaps a dilute experience, it's concentrated, and therefore it continues somehow to operate on you the further away you get from it. It continues to sort of infect you in some way, perhaps like a disease. There are things that you've seen and you think, I couldn't stand that, or I didn't understand it. I didn't understand it. And yet it does seep into your consciousness in the most extraordinary way. I remember seeing Tarkovsky as a young man, as an adolescent, and thinking, I don't get it. But then it's sort of seeping into my dreams. Like
Pina Bausch as well, in that respect.
Exactly.
Taking that a bit further and asking about, the influences, how you come up with a new project, because, you're working with play text sometimes, but novels sometimes, math text and social science text, whatever. How do you develop a new project? Are you very focused, or are there a lot of ideas that you develop and then they sort of end up on the cutting room floor?
Well, you can correct me, interrupt me. There's an idea, and then there's a fantastic team of people in the Complicity office, and we try and set up as much research and development around that idea. This is at the beginning, with as many interesting people that will be able to contribute to the start of a project. And Simon can work with them in various ways, either looking at a text with actors, cutting up the text, putting it on the floor. I can remember A Disappearing Number started exactly like that, with lots of photocopied bits of paper all cut out. And after the research and development, we might move to a different stage.
So is the whole team involved with this research and development? Simon will come up with the idea, and then people will suggest people you might talk to, and
quite often in the office there are people who will know people, or will source people, or will find somebody who knows somebody who is an expert, or we've just got quite very hungry young people who want to help facilitate the work, so they do make it their job to go out and find people who will help them. They don't. Not everybody is necessarily successful, but we try really our utmost to find people who will have the same sort of interests or themes. Marcus de Sautoy is a very an obvious one. We tracked him down when we did a disappearing number, mathematics. We found him, and that was an extraordinary story because when we found him, he said, I know exactly who you are. I used to do your workshops at the Pegasus Theatre in Oxford. And this is, this is Professor Marcus de Sautoy. So.
He was the Seamaney Professor of the Dissemination of Scientific Knowledge, the post that Dawkins held before, that he now holds it.
And then through those people, you meet other people who are also very interested in working with an artist. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll be part of the final production process, but they're there from the beginning.
Right.
I mean, I think if you're making a film, you need to surround yourself, if you're the director of the film, with a lot of creative people. So you need a very creative director of photography who can be as important or more important than the director, and somebody who's working on the sound and the writer. It's a very strange thing, a film, and very odd that it should get made, but everybody is having a kind of a creative input. And I suppose on a much smaller scale, that's the case here, but the creativity reaches right, why we're sitting here together is that the creativity reaches right into the method of producing as well, or not the method, the production in all aspects of it. And in the room, you simply try to encourage everybody to feel free to participate in that process and to contribute ideas. So it's extremely, I mean, the way that I tend to work is extremely chaotic, and it's not for everybody. Some people like a much more structured sense, but you have to remember that each project is very, very different, and that the process is appropriate to that project. So here we're talking about a project which is a devised project, which starts from the fact that I was absolutely shit at mathematics at school, and I'm fascinated by the things that I was hopeless at, or that I know nothing about. And in a way, I see part of my life as a continuous exploration of things that I don't understand. I feel I want to know something about something when I make something. I don't know what it is I'm going to make. However, that's a devised project, so mathematics, and there was a particular story associated, a fragment of a story, which is a relationship between Ramanujan and Hardy. However, there are other projects like Measure for Measure that we did on this stage, which is taking a classic, taking a piece of Shakespeare, and I feel, Shakespeare, I can't believe I haven't done more Shakespeare with the company, because I grew up with Shakespeare. I did, by the time I was, 22 or 23, I'd acted in about 30 of them. So that was very much my background. Here I also did the Caucasian Chalk Circle. We did Endgame. These are texts, and they're rehearsed or perhaps put up in a much more conventional way, or way that people would recognize anyway, even if we, tend to rehearse it in a way which is slightly, a way that I would say is apposite or appropriate for the, given the material and given the people who are in it. So, I mean, the piece that I did, in America with Al Pacino, the Arturo Ui, I had to sort of invent something to do with that, because nobody really quite knew the history of it, and a lot of them were very big film stars, and not all of them were sort of had been in the process of trying to create a company on stage, and I had to create a company, so you had to think of it in a whole different way. So every project is very different. We were thinking about the fact that we made this site-specific piece, what is now, this new thing called immersive theatre, which has only been around for a few hundred years. But anyway, It's not new. It is, everything in the theatre goes round in circles. Anyway, we did a piece of what is now called immersive theatre in the disused Aldwych tube station. It was called A Vertical Line, and John Berger wrote it. I wrote it with him, and it was produced in collaboration with Art Angel, and we took the disused Aldwych tube station, and people went on this very strange and wonderful journey. But that was a very different process, which involved editing film and video. This is about 15 years ago that we did this, to pushing the limits of what you could do with sound underground and so on. So I was just sort of saying that every process is different.
And are you working with requiring different things of different actors across these different sort of projects? So the text, is there such a thing as an ideal complicity actor?
No.
And different ones for different projects, or a divide,
an actor is an actor. I mean, an actor is an actor. I work in film a lot, and on television, and you've got to, every director in film and television is completely different, and they work in a different way. I'm about to do a piece of television where I met the director this morning who said, I've got to have a lot of rehearsal with you, and then there are ones where you walk on set, and you've never even met the director or the other actors, and suddenly you're in the scene.
And many times you've directed yourself, haven't you? You've been in pieces of work that you have directed, and you've been directing and acting.
That's how I started.
Yes.
Because I started very much as an actor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I tried to feel my way into a piece, and that part of that process remains in what we do, in the sense that we put something on, we throw it in front of an audience, and then you see what sticks and what comes back. And then you take it back into the garage and you change it and you work on it. Very much as I have worked a lot with comedians and stand-up comics, and so has Judith from her early days, when we were young. And that's the way that they work, and that's very much, that's also been part of my background. And so working from the inside is you almost like a musician. I mean, that's quite interesting, because I've worked with a string quartet, and a string quartet work like that, in the sense that they have no conductor, and so they choose and argue which pieces they're going to do, and then they have to feel their way into it, and they if you ask any of the any quartet, they will always talk about how it works in front of an audience, and then readjust accordingly.
Yeah.
Can I just say that what I think Simon is very able to do with actors is he's a great choreographer, so he can make a group of actors, an ensemble, really greater than anything I've ever seen anybody else do. There's nobody that will stand out. They're all very, very equal. And I think that's quite an amazing gift to be able to do that. And I find it really fascinating that when he works with Japanese actors who, unbeknownst to us, have all come from different traditions of theatre. They're all very, very, very different, and probably wouldn't ever work together if it wasn't that Simon had brought them together. The ensemble that he can create there is really quite extraordinary.
Yes, I agree with you, absolutely. I just want you to talk about your international work, because this has been an international company really right from the beginning, and you've made work internationally, particularly in Japan and America. And I think, if maybe you're influenced by international theatre makers, perhaps. So you mentioned Pina Bausch. So I think it would be really interesting to hear your take on that. Why have you always seen yourself as an international artist rather than as someone who's just based in this country? It's not terribly usual, actually, in this. There's not so many international companies based here.
No.
And you're the first, I think, British-based artist who was chosen for the Avignon Festival to be the
Artiste
overall.
associé, I mean, it was
which is
extraordinary.
An amazing thing.
for anybody who's in the audience who doesn't know, the last 12 years of the Avignon Festival, what they've done is they had two artistic directors who were not theatre directors, they were producers. And their idea was that they should every year take an artiste associé, an associate artist, with whom they had 2 or 3 years conversations. And as a consequence of those conversations, they created a festival.
Yes.
So it wasn't that it revolved only about their work, but it really meant that they were thinking through the ideas rather than going sort of international theatre supermarket shopping. I'll have half a kilo of Bob Wilson and so on.
A bit of Lepage.
A little bit of Lepage and and so on. But they and so it was a fascinating experience. But how should I mean? That brings up so many questions about the relationship of British theatre, I suppose. Yep. To other places in the world. The traditional export has been sometimes the National Theatre, some dance, I think of Deviate in particular, and various other companies, and traditionally the RSC has done its big sort of tours. It goes out and then comes back. But the majority of transnational, international work is this relationship with the United States. So stuff from the West End going to Broadway, stuff from Broadway coming to the West End. And that is the big relationship. It has been there's much fewer pieces of work going to France, to Germany, to Italy, perhaps relationships with Japan or the Far East, with the Middle East, with Turkey, with Scandinavia. And I suppose right from the beginning, partly because I trained in Paris, and I've never felt particularly English, I felt very happy and happier in some ways, working not just within the context of the English theatre.
And because you didn't have a building, I suppose, you had the freedom to do.
I mean, Peter Brook said something about, I'm name-dropping Peter Brook, but in fact, he did say something, he was asked to say something about us because at one point he said the English have a fine, sophisticated and wonderful theatre tradition. Simon McBurney and Complicity are not part of it. Which I would contest, actually. I mean, I love, I grew up, the pantomime was a huge influence on me. I loved the pantomime. In fact, I used to go and see, because I don't know if there's anybody old enough to remember the name of Cyril Fletcher. Yeah. That was,
So that brings us to the end, just to say thank you very much.
It's the art of collaboration.
Yes, it is the art of collaboration.
Find the people you're going to collaborate with, and that includes, theatre is made by the audience, so you have to perform to a full audience.
Indeed. And you're going to be signing books, I think, in the foyer now, and we have to stop. So please, could you join me in thanking Judith and Simon?